At first glance, one might think this is the United Kingdom, a country noted for its manicured formal gardens and love of flowers. But this is not a stone-fenced, iron-gated suburb of London, Oxford, Bristol, or any other city in the United Kingdom for that matter. It is Victoria, British Columbia, on Canada's west coast. And it is just one reflection of the British influence on Canadian culture and history. Some 2,000 miles to the east, another country besides the United Kingdom comes to mind. Because here, many buildings reflect the unmistakable architecture of France. Moreover, signs are in French, the language spoken in everyday conversation here. If one didn't know better, one might imagine that he or she was in France, not Eastern Canada. Back across the continent, visions of still another country appear. Visions of China. For here, in Vancouver, Oriental influences are seen in many places. And Chinese is the language of choice for many people. Throughout this vast and diverse country, there are people of many different cultural backgrounds. Not only Asians and Europeans, but also Africans and native Canadians, to name just a few. For Canada is, to a large degree, a multicultural country, a land of immigrants. In the 19th century, hundreds of thousands left their homes in old world countries and came to Canada. Many were drawn by inexpensive land offered by the Canadian government. But it was the 20th century that saw the greatest surge of immigration in Canada. Millions of immigrants settled on Canadian farms, as well as in villages, towns, and cities. After World War II, there was another great surge. Italians, Eastern Europeans, Vietnamese, and other Asians came to Canada's shores, settled, and made lives for themselves in their adopted homeland. Even so, British customs and culture prevail throughout most of Canada.
Hi there, Warren.
Language tells at least part of the story. Almost 70% of all Canadians use English as their primary language.
How about 7 o'clock for dinner? That sounds...
The exception is found in the province of Quebec, where French culture prevails, and where French is the official everyday language. For the most part, Canadians are city dwellers. Almost 8 out of 10 live in urban centers with more than 100,000 people. The 5 most populous metropolitan areas are Toronto, with more than 4 million area residents, Montreal, with more than 3 million, then Vancouver, with almost 2 million. Next, the Ottawa-Hull metro area, with more than 1 million, and Edmonton, with about 900,000. In these and other Canadian urban centers, people live much like city dwellers elsewhere in North America and Europe. They take trains, buses, and cars to go to work every day, or to attend school. They spend their leisure time doing many different things, such as attending country fairs, soaking up the sun's warmth at the beach, listening to music, or watching their favorite sports team in person or on TV. 1 out of 5 Canadians lives in a rural area, mostly in small towns or on farms. A small number live in tiny villages. Many in those villages are native Canadians, Indians, who in the main live in the western and southern sections of the country, and the Inuit, who generally live in the north. While many native Canadians, such as this totem pole carver, have kept at least part of their traditions, most tend to live much like other Canadians, as inhabitants of a modern 21st century nation. Native Canadians are believed to have migrated from Asian lands about 11,000 years ago. For thousands of years, they hunted on the land, fished in the waters, and gathered wild vegetation. The first Europeans arrived about 1,000 years ago, when Leif Erikson, a Norse seaman, and his crew were blown off course when attempting to sail from Iceland to Greenland. Instead, they wound up on what is today Canada's east coast. It took about 500 years before any more Europeans would arrive. In 1497, and again in 1498, John Cabot, an Italian explorer whose voyages were underwritten by the English government, explored much of the coastal areas of what would someday become Canada and the United States, especially on his second voyage, whose route is shown here. Cabot's exploration party returned to England with glowing reports of rich fishing waters in the western Atlantic. Within a few years, European fishing vessels made yearly voyages to these teeming waters. But it wasn't fish that brought Europeans to the mainland. It was beaver. For in Europe, beaver pelt hats had become all the rage, and the popularity of those hats fostered a large market for beaver fur. To assist fur trappers and traders, the French set to work, building several small colonies in the late 16th century to act as a base for the fur trade. The area around these colonies was called Acadia. But the colonies were not permanent settlements. That would come later in 1608, when Quebec, the first of many French settlements, was established. Quebec was headed by Samuel de Champlain, a noted geographer and explorer. Champlain eventually became governor of what was called New France, a large area of northeastern North America ruled by the French king, at that time Louis XIII. Louis gave large portions of land in the New World to some members of the French nobility. They, in turn, rented those lands to commoners for a portion of the crops harvested and animals trapped. It was the same system that was used in Europe. France's 17th century adversary, England, especially King Charles II, kept a wary eye on French developments in the New World. The British monarch had his own plans for establishing a presence in North America. In 1670, Charles granted the Hudson's Bay Company exclusive trading rights to all the lands whose rivers and streams drained into Hudson Bay, a huge area encompassing hundreds of thousands of square miles. To counter this intrusion, the French and their Indian allies attacked English forts in the Hudson Bay region in the 1680s, but were unable to defeat them. Skirmishes between French and English forces in North America, one of which is shown in this battle map, were seen throughout much of the early 18th century, as the rivalry between the two European powers continued. Finally, large battles broke out in Europe in 1756. Called the 7 Years' War, it covered almost all of the continent and even beyond. In North America, for example, British and French forces fought to gain control of each other's New World lands. In North America, the 7 Years' War was called the French and Indian War. When peace returned to the region in 1763, England, the victor, took over the eastern portion of what would someday become Canada, an area that previously had belonged to France. But the English never insisted that its new citizens of French ancestry adopt English customs. In 1774, in the Quebec Act, England recognized the Roman Catholic Church in North America, to which most French settlers and their descendants belonged. It also established French civil law. Both actions were meant to create goodwill among those of French heritage. Even though the British governed these former French lands, many there still kept their ties to French culture, something that lives on to this very day, sometimes militantly. In fact, the differences between those of French and English ancestry have never been completely resolved in Canada. In the 1970s, tensions boiled over when many of French descent wanted the province of Quebec to secede or break away from the rest of Canada. Voters turned down the proposed secession. The attempt to secede was revived several more times. But each time, the efforts have failed. Even so, French became the language of Quebec schools, and French was declared the official language of the province in 1976. Today, Canada is legally bilingual, with both French and English as the country's official languages. However, most Canadians view their history and culture as primarily British. In fact, during the American Revolutionary War against England, Canadians did not support their neighbors to the south. Instead, they stayed loyal to the mother country. Many Americans who remained loyal to England fled to Canada at war's end. They were called United Empire Loyalists. The Loyalists brought to Canada a belief in representative government, for they had lived in areas with colonial legislatures. To keep the Loyalists happy, the British divided Quebec into two parts, one whose population was mostly of French heritage, the other British. Known as Upper and Lower Canada, each had a legislative assembly elected by the people. The assemblies had no real power, however. Canadians and Americans have almost always had friendly relations with each other. The one exception was during the War of 1812, when England's Navy stopped and then boarded U.S. ships as the American vessels made their way to France. The French were at war with Great Britain at the time. American sailors were sometimes taken captive to serve on British ships. President James Madison objected to these indignities, and the United States Congress, upon his request, declared war on England. American troops invaded Canadian territory, still under British rule. But when the war ended in 1814, neither side kept any land it had won during the conflict, and relations between Canadians and Americans have been friendly ever since. For the next several decades, in the 1820s and 1830s, Canadians peacefully built cities and established settlements in the West, all the way to the Pacific coast. Despite this outward calm, however, many in Canada had come to feel that their English rulers had too much power, and some rioted against English control in 1837. The British Parliament, fearing there would be another revolution against England in North America, joined Upper and Lower Canada. The British Parliament also established two Canadian legislative bodies elected by the people, an assembly with real power to make laws that would not be subject to England's approval. Then, in 1866, inside this building, Canadian and British leaders drafted the British North America Act, which effectively established Canada's independence. The act passed the British Parliament in 1867. Every July 1st, Canadians mark the act's passage by celebrating Canada Day. The country's symbol, the maple leaf, is found everywhere on the holiday. At night, fireworks fill the skies in towns and cities across the nation. Canadians live under a government modeled on both the British and U.S. systems. Its national government has three branches. First, a judicial branch. Its highest court is the Supreme Court. Next, the legislative branch, composed of two chambers, the Senate and the House of Commons. The House is the more powerful of the two. Finally, there's an executive branch. Its leader, the Prime Minister, has offices in this building in Ottawa, Canada's capital city. Governmental powers are shared between this national government and those of Canada's provinces and territories. Among other things, provincial and territorial governments are largely responsible for education. And by almost all measures, they do an excellent job. Canadian students were ranked among the best educated in the world in a recent United Nations report. Canada's adult literacy rate is also among the best. An important government service in Canada is its National Health Program that can be used by all citizens. But the program is controversial. Some say that although everyone in Canada can see a doctor when they're sick, waits can be long, and the level of care is not always as good as it should be. In short, then, the people of Canada come from many different backgrounds. There are native Canadians, both Indian and Inuit. Many Canadians have ancestors who came from Europe, Britain, France, and other European countries. Still others have forebears from Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, or elsewhere. Canadian history has its roots thousands of years ago, when native peoples hunted buffalo and fished in rivers, lakes, and streams. Canada's history continued as European explorers, both French and English, came to North America, fished its rich coastal waters, and trapped beaver. Canadians, unlike their neighbors to the south, did not have a war of independence against their English rulers. Instead, their country evolved for the most part without bloodshed into an independent nation with democratic institutions and freedom. Canada, a first world country with a proud history and a people strong and free.